The soft hum of chatter and the clinking of cups filled the air at Brio Café, an upscale establishment Michael Grayson frequented during his lunch breaks. He sat in his usual booth by the window, half listening to the muted city sounds while scanning through the documents on his tablet. The café was a sanctuary for him, far from the pressures of boardrooms and business deals, and just quiet enough for him to think. Today, however, no amount of peace or caffeine could calm the storm brewing in his mind. A critical merger was on the line. Michael had spent the last 3 months negotiating an acquisition that would make Grayson Enterprises one of the largest tech firms in the world. He should have been exhilarated, but instead, a strange heaviness had settled over him. Lately, he'd been feeling like something was missing in his life, despite all his accomplishments and wealth. As he stared at the spreadsheets, the familiar routine of numbers and projections began to blur. His thoughts drifted to a distant time, a place he rarely allowed his mind to wander. Sophia. He hadn't thought of her in years, or at least, he had tried not to. It had been 2 decades since the accident, 20 years since he'd lost the one person who had truly understood him before his rise to power. Michael exhaled sharply and was about to shake off the memories when a soft, melodic voice reached his ears. "Excuse me, can I have a black coffee, please?" It wasn't the words that caught him off guard. It was the voice. His heart lurched in his chest. For a second, he felt the world tilt around him. It was impossible, but that voice, it was her voice. His breath quickened as his eyes darted around the cafe, searching for the source of the voice. There, standing by the counter, waiting for her order, was a woman with chestnut brown hair, her back to him. He couldn't see her face, but he didn't need to. His heart told him what his mind couldn't accept. The voice that had haunted him for 2 decades, the voice of the woman he had buried in his heart, was now alive in front of him. Sophia? It couldn't be. She had died in a car accident all those years ago. Michael had attended the funeral himself, had stood by her graveside with tears streaming down his face, watching her casket being lowered into the ground. But now, here she was, alive and breathing. His heart raced as his rational mind fought to catch up with the surreal moment unfolding before him. He stood abruptly, knocking his coffee cup off the table, sending a wave of liquid spilling across his documents. His vision tunneled as he moved through the crowded cafe, his focus locked on her. She was just a few feet away now. "Excuse me," he stammered, his voice thick with disbelief. The woman turned slowly, her movements deliberate, as though sensing the weight of the moment. And then, Michael's world stopped. It was her, Sophia. Her eyes, those warm hazel eyes that had once looked at him with so much love, were now filled with shock, mirroring his own. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, her coffee forgotten. "Michael," she whispered, barely audible over the cafe noise. The sound of her voice, saying his name, made his knees go weak. She had said it just the way she used to, with a softness that only she could muster, as though time had folded in on itself and they were standing in that sunlit park again, where they had shared their first kiss so long ago. He stared at her, his mind racing for some explanation. How is this possible? You're dead." Sophia's face paled. She looked around nervously, as if they were being watched. "Michael, I can't explain here," she said in a low, urgent tone. "I shouldn't even be here. I have to go." "No," he said firmly, reaching out but stopping short of touching her. He was afraid that if he did, she might vanish like a dream. "You're not going anywhere. I thought you were dead for 20 years, Sophia. I need to know what's going on." Her eyes flickered with pain, guilt, and fear. She took a step back, shaking her head. "I can't talk now, Michael. It's too dangerous." "Dangerous?" His mind reeled. "Sophia, where have you been? Why did you disappear?" I can't stay," she interrupted, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please, don't follow me." Before he could stop her, she bolted for the door, weaving through the crowded cafe. Michael watched, frozen, as she vanished into the street. By the time his legs decided to move, she was gone. He burst through the cafe doors, scanning the sidewalks, the sea of people, but there was no sign of her. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Michael stood on the pavement, his heart pounding, his mind refusing to accept what had just happened. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone, his hands shaking. He needed to do something, anything, to find her again. His fingers hovered over his contacts, ready to call a private investigator. But then, he stopped. Who would believe him? How could he explain that his first love, whom everyone had believed dead, was alive? Staring blankly at the busy street, Michael whispered, "What the hell is going on?" The question echoed in his mind, but there were no answers. Only more questions and the cold, gnawing sense that something far darker and more complex than he could imagine was unfolding. Michael's hands trembled as he pocketed his phone, still standing on the bustling sidewalk outside Brio Cafe. The cool autumn air nipped at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing with the impossible. Sophia was alive. 20 years, 2 whole decades of believing she was gone, only to have her reappear like a ghost. He had questions, too many to count, but all of them were swallowed by the shock of the moment. What had she meant by dangerous? Why had she disappeared? And more importantly, why had she stayed hidden all these years? The hum of city life moved around him, indifferent to the turmoil storming inside his chest. People walked by, cars honked, and vendors called out their wares, but Michael was locked in his world of disbelief and confusion. There was no going back now. He had to find her, no matter what. Determined, Michael headed straight for his car, ignoring the fact that his assistant had just texted him 3 times about the merger. Nothing mattered right now except Sophia. He drove recklessly through the city streets, his mind spinning, the images of their past together flashing in his memory like an old reel of film. 20 years ago, they had been inseparable. Sophia was his everything. Before the billions, before the power, before the world had turned him into the Michael Grayson, the man known for his ruthlessness in business and his cold demeanor. Back then, he was just a young man madly in love with a woman whose smile could light up his entire world. But then came the accident, or at least, what he had thought was an accident. She had been driving to meet him one night when her car crashed into the guardrail of a bridge. The news came the next morning. Sophia hadn't survived the wreck. He had been shattered, his world broken. And the worst part? They had argued just before she left that night. Michael had been pushing for them to move forward in their relationship, but Sophia had hesitated, hinting at some fear she never fully explained. He had been too wrapped up in his ambitions, too focused on his growing company to dig deeper. Now, as Michael sped through the city, that guilt gnawed at him. Maybe, just maybe, if he had listened better, paid more attention to the things that troubled her, he would have realized there was something far more dangerous going on in her life than he had ever understood. By the time he reached his penthouse apartment, Michael had already made up his mind. He grabbed his phone again and called the one person he trusted with situations like this. Adam Trent, a top-tier private investigator who specialized in discrete cases involving the elite. Adam had helped him clean up several corporate messes in the past, and if anyone could find Sophia, it was him. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Grayson, it's been a while. What's the problem this time?" Michael wasted no time on pleasantries. "I need you to find someone. Now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "All right, who's the target?" "Sophia Devereaux," Michael said quietly, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. She was declared dead 20 years ago, but I just saw her." Adam's voice remained calm, though Michael could hear the curiosity edging in. "That's quite the claim. Are you sure it was her?" "I know it was her, Adam. I need you to find out where she's been and why she disappeared. And more importantly, why the hell she's still alive." Hours passed like minutes as Michael waited anxiously for Adam to get back to him. He paced his penthouse, his mind circling the same questions over and over again. Why had she run from him? What danger had she been talking about? And who, if anyone, had been behind her supposed death? The sun was beginning to set when Michael's phone finally buzzed. A message from Adam. "Got a lead. She's staying at a small apartment in the West Village. Want to pay her a visit?" Michael stared at the message for a moment, his pulse quickening. This was it. She had hidden herself away for years, and now he was about to confront her. Whatever secrets she had kept were about to come to light. He sent a quick reply. On my way. The West Village was a far cry from the high-end districts Michael frequented. The streets here were quieter, the buildings older, but there was a charm to it, a warmth he could almost imagine Sophia choosing. Michael parked his car and found the address Adam had sent him. A modest brownstone apartment with ivy crawling up the walls. He stood there for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest. What would she say? Would she finally give him answers, or would she vanish again, leaving him more confused than before? Taking a deep breath, he approached the door and knocked. A few seconds passed before he heard light footsteps on the other side. The door creaked open just a fraction, and there she was, peeking out with wide, cautious eyes. Her gaze locked with his, and the tension between them was palpable. "Michael, you shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, stepping closer, forcing the door open wider. "You owe me an explanation, Sophia. I thought you were dead. Everyone thought you were dead." Sophia's expression was a mix of fear and regret. She glanced behind her, as if checking to see if someone was watching, before pulling him inside and quickly closing the door. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with old furniture and personal touches that felt distinctly like her. But Michael barely took it in. His focus was solely on the woman standing in front of him, the woman who had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I never wanted to hurt you, Michael, but I couldn't come back. It wasn't safe." "Safe? What are you talking about? What happened? Sophia, why did you disappear?" Michael's voice was thick with frustration and desperation. "I thought you were gone. I mourned you." Sophia looked down, guilt flashing across her face. I know you did. But it wasn't an accident, Michael. The car crash, it was staged. I didn't have a choice." His mind raced, trying to process her words. "What do you mean it was staged? Who did this to you?" Sophia hesitated, biting her lip as though she was weighing how much she could say. "There are people, dangerous people, who wanted me dead because of something I found out, something I wasn't supposed to know. I had to disappear, Michael, for both our sakes." Michael's stomach twisted. "What did you find out?" She opened her mouth to answer, but then there was a noise outside the window, a faint scuffling sound that made Sophia freeze. Her eyes widened in terror. "They found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before Michael could react, the front window shattered, and chaos erupted around them. The sound of shattering glass jolted Michael into action. Instinctively, he grabbed Sophia by the arm and pulled her toward the far side of the apartment, away from the window. Her fear was palpable, her breathing sharp and panicked, but she moved swiftly alongside him. The noise outside grew louder, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through broken glass. Someone was coming. "We need to get out of here," Michael hissed, scanning the small room for an exit. His eyes landed on a back door, slightly hidden behind a curtain. He motioned for Sophia to follow as they crept toward it, his pulse thundering in his ears. As they reached the door, there was a loud crash from the front of the apartment. Whoever was after her had already forced their way inside. Sophia squeezed his hand, her face pale with terror. "Go," Michael urged, pushing the door open and stepping into the alleyway behind the building. It was dark, damp, and filled with the kind of urban grime that told him this wasn't the kind of place a woman like Sophia belonged. She was used to finer things, at least, she had been when they were together. But now wasn't the time for reflection. They needed to escape. The alley opened up to a side street, where Michael had parked his car. They rushed toward it, and within seconds, they were inside, doors locked, engine revving as Michael pulled into the flow of traffic. He glanced at Sophia, who was breathing hard, her eyes darting nervously between the rearview mirror and the world outside. She was still in danger, and now, so was he. "What the hell is going on?" Michael finally demanded once they'd put enough distance between them and the apartment. "You need to tell me everything, Sophia. No more half answers." She hesitated, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "It's not that simple, Michael. If I tell you, I've already seen more than I bargained for." Whoever those people are, they were ready to kill us both back there. So, unless you want them to catch up to us, you'd better start explaining." Sophia closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She knew he was right. She couldn't keep him in the dark anymore. She had dragged him into her nightmare, and now there was no way out but through. She took a deep breath and began. "It all started with your father's company." Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Of course, it was his father. His entire life had been shaped by his father's decisions, both good and bad, and even in death, the old man still cast a long shadow over everything Michael did. "My father?" he asked, his voice low. Sophia nodded. 20 years ago, I was working with him, doing financial audits for one of his subsidiaries. At the time, I thought it was just routine work, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found something I wasn't supposed to." "What kind of something?" She glanced nervously out the window, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. "Your father was involved in money laundering, Michael. Large sums of money were being funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts. I didn't understand it all at first, but I knew it was illegal. I was young and naive. I thought I could go to him and tell him what I found, that we could fix it." Michael's stomach twisted. His father had always been ruthless in business, but criminal activity? It was something he had never considered. "What did he say when you confronted him?" Sophia shook her head. "I never got the chance to tell him. Before I could even figure out my next move, I started getting threats, anonymous calls, people following me. They told me to stop digging, that if I didn't walk away, something bad would happen. I tried to ignore it, but it got worse. And then the accident happened." Michael's throat went dry. The accident that had supposedly taken her life. "They tried to kill me," she continued, her voice trembling. "That night, they tampered with my car, made it look like a freak accident. I barely survived. I ended up in a hospital under a different name. By the time I recovered, I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. I had to disappear." Michael's mind spun. "Who are they? Who did this to you?" "I don't know all their names," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "But I know your father's business partner, George Baxter, was behind a lot of it. He was the one who orchestrated everything. He had the power, the connections, and the greed to make it all happen. George wanted control of the company, and I was a threat to him. I think he's the one who gave the order to have me killed." The mention of George Baxter sent a chill down Michael's spine. George had been his father's right-hand man, a fixture in his life growing up. After his father's death, George had taken over part of the company, though Michael had always kept him at a distance. Now it all made sense. George had been consolidating power for years, doing whatever it took to stay in control. "And he's still after you?" Michael asked, piecing it together. "That's why you've stayed hidden all these years." Sophia nodded. "I thought I was safe, but recently I started getting messages again. Someone knows I'm alive, and they want me gone for good this time." Michael cursed under his breath. George had been playing a long game, and now, it seemed, he was tying up loose ends, starting with Sophia. But what troubled Michael even more was his father's role in all of this. How deep had his involvement gone? Had his father known about George's plans? Or worse, had he been complicit? As the car sped through the city streets, Michael's mind raced with possibilities. He needed to protect Sophia, but he also needed answers. George was dangerous, and if he truly was after her, then Michael was now in the crosshairs too. There was no way George would let him continue to dig into the company's shady past. Michael's phone buzzed on the dashboard, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Adam, the private investigator. "I've got some more information," Adam said when Michael answered. "Your instincts were right. There's a connection between Sophia and George Baxter. I dug through some old files, and it looks like Baxter has been cleaning up after your father for years. But it gets worse. I think Baxter is pulling strings in your company right now. There's been unusual movement in your accounts, money disappearing into offshore accounts, just like what Sophia described." Michael's blood ran cold. George wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was actively dismantling everything Michael had built, right under his nose. "Michael," Adam's voice was grim, "I think Baxter's planning something big. And if Sophia's back in the picture, it's only a matter of time before he makes his move." Michael's jaw clenched. He had underestimated George Baxter for too long. The man had manipulated his father, nearly destroyed Sophia, and now he was coming for him. But not this time. Not without a fight. Michael glanced at Sophia, her face tense with fear, but also determination. He wouldn't let her disappear again. He wouldn't let George win. "We need to stop him," Michael said, his voice hard with resolve, "before he destroys everything." Sophia looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "But how? He's got the power, the resources." "We take the fight to him," Michael replied, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Whatever he's planning, we're going to expose it, and I'll make sure he pays for what he did to you." Sophia nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fully disappear. They both knew this wasn't going to be easy. George was a dangerous man with powerful connections. But Michael had money, influence, and now, most of all, a reason to fight. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. The tension in the car was thick as they sped through the dimly lit streets, heading back toward Michael's penthouse. He couldn't stop thinking about what Adam had uncovered. George Baxter had been working behind the scenes, siphoning money, playing his own dangerous game within Grayson Enterprises. And now, he was coming for everything. His company, his life, and Sophia. Michael glanced over at her. She sat in silence, staring out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He could see the weight of the years in her expression, the years of hiding, the fear of being hunted. The Sophia he had known all those years ago had been full of life, vibrant and confident. Now, there was a fragility to her, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He wanted to comfort her, to promise that he'd make it all right, but how could he? He was barely processing the revelations himself. His father's legacy, the empire he had inherited, had been tainted by criminal dealings. And George, someone Michael had trusted, was now an enemy who was pulling the strings. "I know this is hard," Michael said, breaking the silence, "but we'll figure this out. I won't let him hurt you again." Sophia turned toward him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You don't understand, Michael. George isn't just some corrupt businessman. He has people, dangerous people, who work for him, people who don't hesitate to kill." Michael clenched his jaw. "We'll find a way to stop him." She shook her head. "You don't know what you're up against. George has always been 2 steps ahead. Even back then, when I found out what your father was involved in, George already had plans in place to silence me. I barely escaped with my life, and if it weren't for some favors I called in, I'd be dead." Michael's heart twisted, hearing her say it out loud. The fact that she had come so close to dying because of his father's secrets made his stomach churn with guilt. He had never imagined the woman he loved had been caught in the crossfire of his father's schemes. "I should have known," Michael muttered under his breath. "I should have looked deeper into what my father was doing. Instead, I was too busy building my own career, focusing on my success. I let this happen." Sophia's hand reached out and gently rested on his arm. "This isn't your fault, Michael. You couldn't have known. Your father kept his darker dealings hidden, even from you. And by the time I found out, it was too late." Her words offered little comfort. The weight of his father's legacy felt heavier now than ever. But there was something else gnawing at him, a growing suspicion that George's reach might be closer than he thought. The unusual movement of funds that Adam had uncovered, the fact that George still had influence in Grayson Enterprises, it all pointed to something bigger. "We need to hit back," Michael said, determination hardening his voice. "We need to expose George, but we have to be careful. If we go after him without a plan, he'll bury us before we even get close." Sophia nodded, though the fear in her eyes lingered. "How? He controls so much. The police, the media, he has them all in his pocket." Michael thought for a moment, piecing together what they could use. "Adam, he has contacts. He can help us dig deeper. If George has been moving money, there has to be a trail, and we need to find out who else is involved. We can't take him down alone." Sophia exhaled shakily. "It's dangerous, Michael. If George finds out we're investigating him, he'll come after us." "I know," Michael said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't stop him, he'll destroy everything." They drove in silence the rest of the way, the weight of their situation pressing down on them both. When they arrived at the penthouse, Michael parked the car and turned to Sophia. "You'll stay here tonight," he said firmly. "It's safe, and I'll have security brought in." Sophia started to protest. "Michael, don't want to drag you into this any more than I already have." "You didn't drag me into anything," he interrupted. "This is my fight too now. You think I'm just going to let him get away with what he's done? With what he did to you?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion, but she didn't say anything more. With a slight nod, she agreed, and they headed inside. Inside the penthouse, Michael's assistant had already left for the night, but the silence only made the tension more palpable. He immediately reached for his phone and dialed Adam's number. It rang twice before Adam picked up. "Grayson," Adam greeted, his tone as curt as ever. "What's the situation?" "I need you to dig deeper," Michael said, pacing across the room. "George Baxter isn't just after Sophia. He's making moves in the company, and I need to know exactly how far his reach goes. Who he's working with, how deep the corruption runs, everything." Adam was silent for a moment. "I had a feeling this was bigger than just her disappearance. I'll pull in a few more favors, see what I can find out. But be careful, Michael. If Baxter's as dangerous as you say, poking around could set off alarms." "I know the risks," Michael said, "but this is personal now." "Understood," Adam replied. "I'll be in touch." Michael ended the call and turned to Sophia, who was standing by the large windows overlooking the city. She seemed so small, so vulnerable in that moment, and it pained him to see her like this. He walked over to her, standing beside her as they both stared out at the skyline. "Do you think we can really win?" she asked quietly. Michael's jaw clenched. "We have to. I've already lost you once. I'm not going to lose you again." Sophia's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she turned to face him. "You don't know how much I've missed you, Michael. There were so many times I wanted to come back, but I couldn't. I was terrified that if I did, they'd kill you too." Michael reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that slipped down her cheek. "You're here now. That's what matters. And this time, we'll face it together." For a moment, the tension between them melted away, and it was as if they were the same two people they had been all those years ago, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. But the moment was fleeting. They both knew the danger that still lurked in the shadows, and there was no escaping it. The next morning, Michael woke early, his mind already focused on the battle ahead. He left Sophia asleep in the guest room and made his way to his office, where he spent hours reviewing financial records, looking for any anomalies that might indicate George's involvement. It was tedious work, but he knew that if they were going to bring George down, they needed solid evidence. A knock on the door interrupted his concentration. It was his assistant, Grace, looking concerned. "Mr. Grayson, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him a tablet. Michael took it, his eyes narrowing as he saw the headline. "Grayson Enterprises under federal investigation for money laundering scandal." His blood ran cold. It was already happening. George was making his move. Michael's heart pounded as his eyes scanned the headline on the tablet. "Grayson Enterprises under federal investigation for money laundering scandal." The article detailed allegations that the company had been involved in illegal financial activities, with millions funneled into offshore accounts, a perfect match to the scheme Sophia had described. His company was being dragged through the mud, and worse, the accusations were all true, but they weren't his crimes. They were George Baxter's. Michael slammed the tablet down on his desk, anger boiling up inside him. George had timed this perfectly. The scandal would destroy not only his reputation, but also his entire business empire. Everything Michael had worked for was crumbling in front of him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as his mind raced for a solution. The investigation wasn't just a threat to his company. It was also a threat to Sophia. If the authorities started digging, George would make sure they found exactly what he wanted them to. Evidence that painted Sophia as part of the conspiracy. George had spent decades orchestrating this, and now, Michael realized, it was all coming to a head. He needed to move fast. Grabbing his phone, he called Adam, who picked up on the first ring. "I saw the news," Adam said, his voice tense. "This is bad, Michael. Really bad." "I know," Michael replied, pacing his office. "George is behind it. He's trying to take me down by pinning the blame on me for what he did. And worse, if they dig too deep, they'll find a connection to Sophia. She's in more danger than ever." Adam sighed. "I've been digging, but Baxter is good. He's covered his tracks well. The only lead I have is a handful of people who worked with him in the past. If we can get one of them to talk, we might be able to expose him, but it won't be easy." Michael clenched his fist. "We don't have time for easy. We need to force his hand." "How do you plan on doing that?" Adam asked, skepticism in his voice. Michael didn't have a clear answer yet. All he knew was that he couldn't sit idly by while George dismantled his life. "I'll figure something out," he said, before hanging up the phone. Sophia was waiting for him in the living room when he stepped out of his office. She had seen the headline too. The worry etched on her face was unmistakable. "I saw the news," she said softly. "It's starting, isn't it? George is coming after you, after us." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "He's making his move, but we're not going to let him win. I'm not losing everything because of him." Sophia's hands trembled as she sat down on the couch, her eyes filled with fear. "Michael, this is bigger than both of us. George has connections, people in high places. If he can frame you for this, there's no telling what else he can do. And if the investigation gets close to me—" "I won't let that happen," Michael interrupted, his voice firm. "We'll find a way to expose him. But we need to be smart about this." Sophia looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't help but feel like this is all my fault. If I hadn't gotten involved with your father's business, if I hadn't uncovered those files, none of this would be happening." Michael walked over to her, kneeling down so he could meet her gaze. "This is not your fault, Sophia. George is the one responsible, not you. He's been manipulating people, using them for his own gain. My father trusted him, and look what it's cost us both." Sophia blinked back tears, her lips trembling. "But what if we can't stop him? What if we're too late?" "We're not too late," Michael said, his voice hard with determination. "We still have a chance. I have Adam working on finding someone who can testify against George. If we can get enough evidence, we can turn the tables on him." Sophia nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. She had been on the run for so long, living in the shadows, constantly looking over her shoulder. Now that she had come back into Michael's life, it felt like those same shadows were closing in on them both. Michael stood up, his mind racing with ideas. He needed to hit back at George, something bold, something that would force his hand. And then it hit him, the board. George was still involved with Grayson Enterprises, but more importantly, he had allies on the board of directors, men who were loyal to him, either out of fear or greed. If Michael could rally the rest of the board, he might be able to force George out before the investigation escalated. Later that afternoon, Michael called an emergency meeting with the board. The men around the table looked uneasy as they gathered in the conference room at Grayson Tower. They had all seen the news, and whispers of the investigation were already spreading throughout the company. Michael stood at the head of the table, his expression grim as he faced them. "You've all seen the reports," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "The company is under federal investigation for money laundering, and the accusations are serious. But I want to make one thing clear. I am innocent. These accusations stem from actions taken long before I took over this company." The board members exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Michael knew they were waiting for him to offer a solution, a way out of the mess that didn't involve them losing their fortunes. "I have reason to believe that someone within our ranks has been orchestrating this," Michael continued. "Someone who has been manipulating the company for years, siphoning money into offshore accounts and framing me for it. That person is George Baxter." A few murmurs spread around the room, but Michael pressed on. "I have evidence linking George to these illegal activities, and I'm working on gathering more. But we need to act fast. George still has allies in this room, men who stand to gain from his schemes. I'm asking the rest of you to stand with me. We need to oust him from the board and cut off his influence before he does any more damage." Silence fell over the room. The men looked at each other, uncertainty written on their faces. Finally, one of the older board members, a man named Richard Mason, spoke up. "Michael, these are serious accusations. If George really is behind this, it's not just the company at risk, it's all of us. Are you sure you can prove it? Michael nodded. I have a private investigator working on it as we speak, but we need to move quickly. If we don't, George will burn this company to the ground and take us all down with him. More murmurs. Some of the men nodded in agreement, others still looked unsure. But Michael could see the fear in their eyes. They knew the stakes were high, and they also knew that George wouldn't hesitate to throw them under the bus if it meant saving himself. Richard cleared his throat. All right, Michael, I'm with you, but we need to be careful. George has powerful friends. If we're going to take him down, we need to make sure we do it right. Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. Thank you, Richard. I won't let you down. The meeting ended with tentative support from the board, but Michael knew they were still walking a fine line. George was a master manipulator, and if he caught wind of their plans, he'd retaliate with everything he had. Michael had bought himself a little time, but it wasn't enough. He needed more evidence, more leverage. Later that night, as he sat in his office, his phone buzzed with a text from Adam. I've got a lead. George's offshore accounts are connected to a high-level government official. You're going to want to see this. Michael's pulse quickened. This was the breakthrough they needed. If they could prove George's connections ran this deep, they might have a chance to turn the tide. But as he stared at the message, something else occurred to him. If George was connected to a government official, they were dealing with more than just corporate corruption. This went beyond the company. It was bigger than he had imagined, and it made everything far more dangerous. Michael stared at the message on his phone, Adam's words echoing in his mind. George's offshore accounts are connected to a high-level government official. This wasn't just about taking over the company anymore. It was about power, influence, and something far more sinister than he had imagined. George had dangerous allies in places Michael couldn't reach, and that made him more formidable than ever. He quickly called Adam back. The investigator picked up on the first ring. Tell me everything, Michael said, his voice low but urgent. I did some digging into George's offshore accounts, Adam explained. It's worse than we thought. He's not just funneling money for himself. He's involved in a larger scheme. Money laundering, bribery, political favors. One of the names that keeps coming up is Senator Raymond Klein. Michael's stomach dropped. Klein was a rising star in Washington, a man with a reputation for being untouchable, clean, and charismatic. If George had ties to him, it meant he had protection from the highest levels of government. Klein's name is on the paperwork for several shell companies linked to George's offshore accounts, Adam continued. The money's been moving through a series of international transfers, but it all traces back to both of them. This is serious, Michael. If Klein finds out we're onto him, he won't hesitate to make us disappear. He's got power that stretches far beyond anything we've dealt with before. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. Then we need to move fast. Can you get me concrete proof? Something we can use? I'm working on it, but this isn't going to be easy. These are powerful men, and they've been covering their tracks for years. We'll need to hit them hard with solid evidence, or they'll crush us before we can make a move. Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Do whatever it takes. We're running out of time. As he ended the call, his mind raced with the implications of what Adam had uncovered. George wasn't just coming for his company. He was part of something far larger and more dangerous. If Michael didn't act soon, he wouldn't just lose everything he'd built. He and Sophia could be silenced for good. Michael returned to the living room, where Sophia sat curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, though it was clear her mind was elsewhere. She looked up when he entered, her eyes filled with the same worry that had plagued them both for days. Any news? She asked quietly. Michael hesitated for a moment, wondering how much he should tell her. The less she knew, the safer she'd be. But keeping secrets from her had already caused enough damage. She had a right to know what they were up against. Adam found something, he said, sitting beside her. George's money is tied to a senator, a man named Raymond Klein. Sophia's eyes widened in shock. Klein? The senator from D.C.? I've heard of him. He's powerful. Exactly, Michael replied grimly. He's been laundering money through the same shell companies George uses. If George is in trouble, Klein will protect him. And that makes this far more dangerous than we thought. Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she processed the information. What are we going to do? You can't fight men like that, Michael. They have too much power, too many connections. Michael reached out and took her hand, trying to steady her nerves. We're not going to fight them head-on. Not yet. Adam's digging for more evidence. Once we have it, we'll take it to the authorities. But we need to be smart about this. We can't afford to make any mistakes. Sophia nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. What if they find out before we have enough proof? They'll come after you, Michael. And if they do... Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. George and Klein wouldn't just come after him. They'd come after her too. I won't let that happen, Michael said firmly. I've already arranged for more security. You're safe here, and I'll make sure it stays that way. But even as he said the words, he knew there were no guarantees. The stakes were getting higher by the minute, and George wasn't the type of man to sit back and let someone unravel his plans. The next few days passed in a blur of tense waiting. Michael barely slept, spending most of his time in his office, coordinating with Adam and his legal team. They were working around the clock, gathering evidence, tracing financial transactions, and building a case that could stand up in court. But the clock was ticking, and Michael knew George wasn't going to wait for them to strike first. On the fourth night, just as Michael was finishing a call with Adam, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, but the contents made his blood run cold. I know what you're doing, Michael. Walk away, or Sophia will disappear for good this time. GB. Michael's breath caught in his throat. George knew. He had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to make his move. And now, he was threatening the one person Michael couldn't afford to lose. Without thinking, Michael rushed out of his office and into the guest room where Sophia had been staying. She was sitting on the bed, reading. But the look on Michael's face must have told her something was wrong. Michael, what is it? She asked, standing up, her voice laced with concern. They know, Michael said, his voice strained. George knows we're investigating him. He just sent me a message. Sophia's eyes widened in fear. What does he want? He's threatening you, Michael said, his jaw clenched with anger. He said if we don't stop, you'll disappear for good. Sophia's face paled. She had been living with the fear of being hunted for years, but hearing it from Michael's lips brought it all rushing back. Michael, we can't do this. We have to stop. I won't let him hurt you because of me. Michael stepped closer, his voice low but fierce. I'm not stopping, Sophia. I lost you once, and I'm not losing you again. We're going to finish this, and we're going to take George down, no matter what it takes. Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes. You don't understand. George is capable of anything. He'll kill us both if it means saving himself. I won't let that happen, Michael insisted, his voice hard with determination. I've already lost too much because of him. He won't take anything else from us. Sophia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't let you do this for me. I can't be the reason you get hurt. Michael reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. You're not the reason. George is. And this time, we're going to end it. She nodded, though fear still gripped her. What are we going to do? Michael's eyes hardened with resolve. We're going to force his hand. George wants us to back off, but instead, we're going to push harder. We'll make him panic, and when he does, he'll make a mistake. And when that happens, we'll be ready. The following morning, Michael met with Adam in a secure location, far from any prying eyes or ears. The investigator laid out a series of documents on the table between them, detailing the web of offshore accounts, shell companies, and financial transfers that linked George to Senator Klein. It was enough to make even the most seasoned attorney balk. This is everything we've got so far, Adam said, tapping the papers with his finger. It's solid, but it's not enough to bring them down yet. We need more. Someone on the inside who can testify, someone who knows the full extent of George's operation. Michael nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. And what about Klein? Is there any way we can tie him directly to the money laundering? Not yet, Adam replied, shaking his head, but I'm working on it. The key is finding someone willing to talk. George has burned a lot of bridges over the years, so I'm sure we can find someone with a grudge. But it's going to take time. We don't have time, Michael said, his voice tight with frustration. "George is already threatening Sophia. He's not going to sit back and wait for us to take him down." Adam leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Then we need to push him harder. If we can force him into a corner, he'll slip up. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and he'll come after you both." Michael's jaw clenched. He was willing to risk everything to protect Sophia, but the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. George had powerful friends, and if they weren't careful, they could find themselves buried under a mountain of corruption and violence. That night, as Michael lay in bed beside Sophia, his mind churned with plans and possibilities. They were walking a razor's edge, and one wrong move could cost them everything. But Michael knew there was no turning back now. George had threatened the one person he loved, and that was something he could never forgive. He wrapped his arm around Sophia, pulling her close, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. She had been through so much, and now, after all these years, they were finally facing the monster that had haunted their past. "I won't let him hurt you," Michael whispered into the darkness. "I promise." Sophia stirred slightly, her voice barely audible. "Just promise me one thing, Michael."
"What?"
"If it comes down to it, if it's between your life and mine, don't sacrifice yourself for me." Michael's heart ached at the thought. He couldn't imagine a world without her in it, but he didn't respond. He couldn't make that promise, because he knew, deep down, that he would do whatever it took to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The air in Michael's penthouse felt heavy with anticipation. Days had passed since George's chilling message, and the tension between Michael and Sophia was palpable. Despite the danger looming over them, they had pressed forward, working with Adam to gather the final pieces of evidence. Now, the trap was set. Michael stood in front of the large windows that overlooked the glittering New York skyline, his reflection staring back at him, the weight of the fight ahead visible in the lines of his face. Sophia sat on the couch, her nerves frayed, though she tried to remain composed. The darkness that surrounded them mirrored the uncertainty they both felt. The only certainty was that this night would change everything. "Are you sure this will work?" Sophia asked, her voice betraying the anxiety that had been building since Adam's last update. Michael turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It has to. We've spent the last week making sure George feels the pressure. He's backed into a corner, and when we push him hard enough, he'll lash out. That's when we'll catch him." Sophia bit her lip, glancing toward the door as if she half expected someone to burst through at any moment. "And if he doesn't?" "He will," Michael said firmly, though doubt gnawed at him deep inside. He couldn't let that show. Not now. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They had leaked just enough information about George's illegal dealings to set him on edge. The whispers in the financial world were getting louder. Rumors of investigations, talk of people close to George flipping on him. It was all designed to make him paranoid, to push him into making a move. Tonight, Michael had arranged a meeting with George under the guise of discussing the ongoing investigation. Adam had tipped off a contact within law enforcement who would be watching from a distance, ready to step in when George made his move. If all went well, George would incriminate himself. But Michael knew better than to expect things to go according to plan. George was too calculating for that. He would have a backup plan. Something ruthless, something final. "You should stay here," Michael said, his voice softening as he walked toward Sophia. "Let me handle this. I don't want you anywhere near him." Sophia shook her head, standing up to face him. "No. I've spent 20 years running from him, hiding in the shadows. I'm not going to disappear again, Michael. I need to see this through." Michael took her hand, his thumb tracing a gentle line across her knuckles. "I know, but I don't want you in harm's way." "Neither of us is safe," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the fear he saw in her eyes. "We have to do this together." Michael nodded reluctantly, pulling her into an embrace. For a moment, they stood there in silence, clinging to each other as if it might be the last time. The weight of the years they had lost, the danger they now faced, pressed in around them. But they had come too far to turn back now. The meeting was set at a high-end private club on the Upper East Side, a place frequented by the city's elite. The kind of place where deals were made in whispers, and secrets were kept behind closed doors. Michael arrived first, his heart pounding in his chest as he handed his coat to the concierge and made his way to the secluded meeting room. The room was dimly lit, with dark wood paneling and plush leather chairs that exuded power and privilege. Michael took a seat, his eyes scanning the space. Adam had assured him that they were being watched from a distance, but the tension in the air was suffocating. He knew George would come prepared, and the thought of what might happen if things went wrong gnawed at him. Minutes later, the door creaked open, and George Baxter stepped inside, his presence like a cold gust of wind. He looked as composed as ever, dressed in a tailored suit, his face betraying none of the turmoil that Michael knew must be boiling beneath the surface. George had always been a master at hiding his true intentions, but tonight, Michael saw something different in his eyes, something darker, more dangerous. "Well, Michael," George said, his voice smooth as he took a seat across from him, "I must say, I was surprised by your invitation, especially given the circumstances." Michael leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression neutral. "We both know what's happening, George. The investigation, the rumors, it's all closing in on you." George's smile didn't falter, though his eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "Is that so? I've been through worse. You should know better than anyone that I always come out on top." "Not this time," Michael replied, his voice hardening. "You've crossed too many lines. There's no way out of this." George chuckled softly, leaning forward slightly. "I think you underestimate just how many ways out I have. But let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want, Michael? Why are we really here?" Michael's pulse quickened. This was the moment. He had to push George to reveal his hand, to make a mistake. "I want you to step down from Grayson Enterprises," he said evenly. "Cut your ties to the company, admit what you've done, and walk away." George's smile faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Is that what you think? That you can blackmail me into stepping down? After everything I've built, everything I've taken from your father's pathetic little empire?" Michael felt a surge of anger, but kept his composure. "You built it on lies, on illegal deals. And now, we have the evidence to prove it." George's expression darkened. "You think you're clever, don't you? Digging into my affairs, stirring up trouble. But you've made a mistake, Michael." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tension crackling between them, the dangerous edge in George's voice. But he pressed on, his voice steady. "The only mistake I made was trusting you. But that ends now." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then, slowly, George leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You should have walked away when I gave you the chance," George said, his voice low and menacing. "Now, I'll have to clean up this mess. And I'm afraid it's going to get very, very ugly." Before Michael could respond, the door behind him creaked open again. He turned to see two men stepping into the room, their expressions cold and menacing. Michael's heart sank. He had expected George to come prepared, but he hadn't anticipated this. "What is this?" Michael asked, his voice tight with fear and anger. George stood up, his smile widening. "I warned you, Michael. You could have walked away, but now you've forced my hand. And unfortunately for you, there's no one coming to save you." Michael's mind raced. He had security nearby, but the men George had brought looked like professionals, dangerous, lethal. This was no ordinary business meeting anymore. It was a trap. Before he could react, one of the men grabbed Michael by the arm, yanking him out of the chair. The other pulled out a gun, pointing it directly at his chest. "I told you," George said, stepping closer, his voice dripping with malice. "You should have stayed out of my way." Michael's breath caught in his throat, panic rising as the reality of the situation sank in. He had walked right into George's trap, and now his life, and Sophia's, was hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, back at the penthouse, Sophia sat by the window, her heart racing with anxiety. She had tried to distract herself with a book, but her thoughts kept drifting to Michael and the danger he was facing. She had a bad feeling about the meeting, a sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Her heart stopped when she saw the words. "It's done. Michael's not coming back. You're next. GB." Sophia's blood ran cold. She knew what the message meant. George had made his move, and now he was coming for her. Without hesitation, she grabbed her things and bolted for the door. She couldn't stay here, not when George knew where she was. As she rushed down the hallway toward the elevator, her mind raced with fear and panic. She needed to find a way to escape, to disappear again. But where could she go? How could she outrun a man like George? The elevator doors slid open, and as she stepped inside, she realized with a sinking feeling that she was running out of time. The cold muzzle of the gun pressed against Michael's chest, and time seemed to slow. His heart hammered in his ears as George's smug face loomed closer, his cruel smile sending waves of dread through Michael's body. He had walked right into the lion's den, and now, staring into the eyes of the man who had orchestrated his downfall, Michael realized just how high the stakes truly were. "What's the plan, George?" Michael said, forcing his voice to stay steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You think killing me will solve all your problems?" George chuckled, stepping even closer. "Of course not, but it's a start. With you out of the way, I'll have full control of Grayson Enterprises. No one will stand in my way." "You're delusional," Michael spat, his anger flaring despite the danger. "You won't get away with this." "Adam, your investigator?" George interrupted, his voice dripping with mockery. "I've had him followed for days. He's not the only one with contacts, Michael. Do you really think I'd let some third-rate PI ruin everything I've built? He won't be a problem for long." A chill ran down Michael's spine. George had planned this meticulously, down to every last detail. He had overestimated how much control he had and underestimated just how ruthless George could be. But he wasn't about to give up, not with so much at stake. Not with Sophia's life on the line. "Do it then," Michael said, his jaw clenched. "Kill me. But know this, you won't just have me to answer for. The evidence I have on you will still get out. The authorities will find it, and they'll come after you. You'll end up behind bars, or worse." George's eyes flickered with irritation, and for a brief moment, Michael saw a crack in his calm facade. But before George could respond, there was a sudden commotion from outside the room. The sound of footsteps, shouting. Something was happening. The two men holding Michael glanced toward the door, momentarily distracted. That was all the opportunity Michael needed. With a surge of adrenaline, Michael twisted free of the man's grip, slamming his elbow into the gunman's arm, knocking the weapon away. The second man lunged at him, but Michael was quicker, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it hard into his attacker's side, sending him crashing to the ground. George backed up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You idiot!" he shouted at his men, but before they could recover, the door burst open, and two police officers stormed in, weapons drawn. "Hands in the air!" one of the officers barked, and the men reluctantly complied, raising their hands as the officers moved in to secure them. Michael stumbled back, catching his breath as relief washed over him. Adam had come through after all. George glared at Michael, seething with rage as the officers moved to arrest him. "This isn't over, Grayson," he snarled. "You'll regret this." But Michael was done with George's threats. "I doubt that," he said coldly, watching as the officers cuffed him. "You've lost." George struggled against the handcuffs, but it was clear that his reign of terror was over. The man who had manipulated, blackmailed, and threatened so many people was finally going to face justice. But Michael's relief was short-lived. As George was led away, a new wave of panic hit him. "Sophia." Sophia's fingers trembled as she read the message on her phone. "It's done. Michael's not coming back. You're next." Her entire world collapsed in that moment. The love of her life, the man who had promised to protect her, was gone. And now George was coming for her, to finish what he had started all those years ago. She couldn't stay in the penthouse, not now that George knew where she was. She needed to run, to disappear again. But her mind was in chaos, clouded by grief and fear. "I can't lose him again. I can't do this." Tears stung her eyes as she grabbed her coat and keys, rushing toward the elevator. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed the button frantically, every second feeling like an eternity. She couldn't stay in the city. She needed to go somewhere George couldn't find her, somewhere she could be safe. But where? How? The elevator doors opened, and Sophia stepped inside, her thoughts racing with panic and dread. Just as the doors began to close, a hand reached in, stopping them. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as the doors slid open, revealing Michael standing there, bruised and breathing hard, but very much alive. "Michael?" Sophia gasped, her heart soaring in disbelief. "How?" Before she could finish, Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, it all melted away as they stood there in the elevator, wrapped in each other's arms. He was alive. He had come back for her. "I thought you were dead," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm here," Michael murmured into her hair, holding her tighter. "I'm here, and it's over. George is done." Sophia pulled back slightly, searching his face for answers. "What happened?" "Adam came through," Michael explained, still catching his breath. "He had the police ready to move in. They arrested George. He's not coming after us anymore." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. "But I got a message. He said you weren't coming back." Michael's expression hardened. It was another one of George's games. He was trying to scare you into running. He knew his time was up, and he was trying to hurt us one last time. Sophia let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I lost you." "You'll never lose me," Michael said softly, brushing the tears from her cheeks. "Not again." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, holding each other as the weight of everything they had been through settled around them. They had both been pushed to the brink, but they had made it through. Together. Hours later, as the first light of dawn crept over the city skyline, Michael and Sophia sat together on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the world wake up around them. The danger had passed, and for the first time in years, Sophia felt a sense of peace. "What happens now?" Sophia asked quietly, resting her head on Michael's shoulder. Michael glanced down at her, his expression soft. "Now, we start over. No more looking over our shoulders. No more running. We take back our lives." Sophia smiled faintly, though the scars of the past still lingered. "Do you think it's really over?" Michael paused, considering the question. George might be gone, but there are still people out there who were part of what he built. "It won't be easy, but we'll fight them if we have to. Together." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and love for the man beside her. After everything they had endured, the lies, the betrayals, the danger, they had survived. And now, they had a chance at something new, something better. "I never thought we'd get here," she whispered. "Neither did I," Michael admitted, kissing the top of her head. "But we're here now, and this time, we're not letting anyone take it away from us." Sophia closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the morning sun wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt free. Free from the past, free from fear, free to build a life with the man she had always loved. The nightmare was over, and together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Michael's penthouse, casting long shadows across the room. A few weeks had passed since George's arrest, and life had begun to settle into a strange calm for both Michael and Sophia. The chaos and danger that had threatened their lives had subsided, but the aftermath of their fight was far from over. Michael stood in the kitchen, his coffee untouched as he stared out at the city below. It was still surreal. How close they had come to losing everything, and how much had changed in such a short time. George was in custody, facing multiple charges for money laundering, conspiracy, and corruption. Senator Klein, too, was under investigation, though his influence in Washington meant that the case against him was progressing more slowly. Still, the tide had turned, and for the first time in years, Michael felt like he could breathe again. But as the dust settled, new challenges emerged. Grayson Enterprises had taken a hit. The federal investigation had shaken investor confidence, and several key deals had fallen through in the wake of the scandal. The board was in turmoil, and although Michael had managed to remove George's influence from the company, there were still factions within the organization loyal to George, or at least, loyal to the profits his schemes had promised. Rebuilding the company's reputation would be a long and difficult process. Michael knew he could handle that. Business was in his blood, and he had always thrived under pressure. What worried him more was the uncertainty of his future with Sophia. They had been through hell together, but the scars from their past ran deep. Sophia had lived in fear for so long that even now, with George out of the picture, she seemed hesitant to let go completely. Michael could see it in her eyes, the way she glanced over her shoulder in crowded places, the way her hands trembled when the phone rang unexpectedly. She was still haunted by the ghost of the life she had left behind. And then there was the matter of their relationship. The love between them was undeniable, but the years apart had changed them both. Michael was no longer the young, ambitious man he had been when they first fell in love, and Sophia had been shaped by her years in hiding, by the fear and isolation that had defined her life. They had found each other again, but now they had to figure out how to build a future together. Sophia entered the kitchen quietly, wrapped in one of Michael's oversized shirts, her hair tousled from sleep. She smiled when she saw him, but there was still a trace of that old sadness in her eyes. "Morning," she said softly, walking over to him. "Morning," Michael replied, pulling her into his arms. For a moment, they stood there in comfortable silence, the warmth of their embrace easing the weight of the world outside. But Michael could sense the unspoken tension between them, both of them wondering what came next. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked, her voice tinged with concern. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just thinking. There's a lot to do with the company. The fallout from the investigation, rebuilding trust with investors. It's going to take time." Sophia nodded, though her expression grew distant. "And what about us?" she asked quietly. Michael's heart clenched. He had been waiting for this conversation, but that didn't make it any easier. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted, stepping back slightly so he could look into her eyes. "I love you, Sophia. I always have, and I always will. But I know things aren't the same as they used to be. We've both changed." Sophia swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know. I've been running for so long, Michael. I don't know how to just stop. Even now, I keep expecting something to happen, like George is going to show up out of nowhere and take everything away again." "He's gone," Michael said firmly. "He can't hurt you anymore." "I know," Sophia whispered, "but it's hard to believe that, after everything. I've spent so many years looking over my shoulder, and now, I don't know how to just be." Michael reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "We can figure it out. Together. We've already survived the worst, Sophia. Now it's time to live. No more running. No more fear." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. "What if I don't know how to live without the fear?" Michael's chest tightened at her vulnerability. She had been so strong, so resilient through everything, but he knew how much the years of hiding had cost her. He had seen the toll it had taken on her spirit. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said softly. "There's no rush. We've got all the time in the world now." Sophia smiled through her tears, her hand tightening in his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me." "I never will," Michael replied, kissing her forehead gently. "I've waited too long for this. For us." Over the next few weeks, Michael and Sophia worked to rebuild their lives, both individually and together. Michael threw himself into the task of restoring Grayson Enterprises, working long hours to stabilize the company and repair its damaged reputation. It was exhausting work, but it gave him a sense of control, a way to channel the frustration and anger he still felt over everything George had done. Sophia, meanwhile, took steps toward reclaiming her own sense of normalcy. She began attending therapy sessions, determined to face the trauma she had endured and find a way to heal. It was a difficult process, and there were days when the memories overwhelmed her, when she felt like she couldn't escape the past. But slowly, she began to make progress. She started exploring her old passions, art, photography, writing, and found that these creative outlets helped her reconnect with the parts of herself she had buried for so long. One afternoon, as Michael was finishing up a meeting at the office, he received a call from Sophia. Her voice was filled with excitement, a stark contrast to the nervous tone he had grown used to. "Michael, I've been thinking," she said. "What if we got away for a while? Just the two of us. No work, no distractions. I think it's what we need. Michael smiled, surprised by the suddenness of her suggestion. You mean like a vacation? Exactly, she replied, her voice light with hope. Somewhere quiet, peaceful. A place where we can just be. Michael considered the idea, his mind flashing through the endless meetings and obligations he had in the coming weeks. But as he listened to Sophia's voice, he realized she was right. They needed this. He needed this. For so long, their lives had been defined by crisis after crisis, and now, for the first time, they had a chance to breathe. Let's do it, Michael said, feeling a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. Where do you want to go? Sophia laughed softly, the sound filling him with warmth. Anywhere but here. 2 weeks later, they found themselves in the French countryside, a world away from the chaos of New York City. The small, secluded villa they had rented was nestled in the rolling hills, surrounded by vineyards and wildflowers. It was peaceful, quiet, the perfect place to escape the pressures of their lives and reconnect with each other. For the first time in years, Michael felt the weight lifting from his shoulders. The days were filled with simple pleasures, long walks through the vineyards, quiet afternoons spent reading in the garden, and evenings spent under the stars, sharing wine and laughter. It was the life they had dreamed of, but never thought possible. One night, as they sat together on the terrace, Michael looked over at Sophia, her face illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight. She was smiling, truly smiling, without the shadow of fear or pain lurking in her eyes. I've missed this, Sophia said quietly, reaching for his hand. I've missed us. Michael squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. So have I, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. And I promise, I'm never letting this go. Sophia's smile deepened as she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a tender kiss. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered happiness, one that neither of them would ever take for granted again. They had survived the worst. Now, it was time to build something new. Together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the French countryside. Michael and Sophia sat side by side on the terrace of their villa, the soft hum of nature around them creating a peaceful rhythm. They had spent nearly a month in this quiet haven, far from the pressures of New York, and in that time, they had begun to heal. The scars from their past were still there, but they were no longer raw. Together, they had found a way to move forward. Michael glanced over at Sophia, who was sketching something in a small notebook. Her expression was serene, her eyes focused on the drawing as the late afternoon sun bathed her in its warm light. It was a stark contrast to the woman he had first reunited with, the woman who had been running for so long, trapped in the shadows of her fear. Now, she was at peace. You look happy, Michael said, a soft smile playing on his lips. Sophia looked up, her eyes sparkling. I am, she replied, her voice filled with a quiet joy that had once seemed impossible. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm really living. Michael's heart swelled at her words. They had been through so much, loss, betrayal, danger, but they had come out the other side stronger. Together, they had rebuilt their lives, piece by piece, and now, they had a future to look forward to, one that wasn't defined by fear or the past, but by love and the life they were creating together. I've been thinking about what comes next, Michael said, leaning back in his chair, his gaze drifting out over the vineyards. We've spent so much time running from everything. Now it's time to figure out what we want. Sophia smiled softly, setting her notebook aside. What do you want, Michael? He paused, considering her question. For so long, his life had been consumed by ambition, by the need to build, to achieve, to prove himself. But now, for the first time, he felt like he had something more valuable than any business deal or financial success. I want a life with you, Michael said simply, his voice filled with certainty. I want us to stop running. I want us to build something together, something real. A life where we don't have to look over our shoulders anymore. Sophia's eyes softened as she reached out and took his hand. That's what I want too, she said quietly. But are you ready to let go of everything? Grayson Enterprises, your life in New York? Michael nodded. I've been thinking about that a lot. The company. It's been a huge part of my life, but I don't want it to define me anymore. I've spent too long chasing success, and I've realized that I don't need it. Not like I thought I did. What I need is you. What we have. Sophia's gaze held his, her hand squeezing his gently. We can have both, Michael. You don't have to give up everything. But maybe it's time for a new chapter. A fresh start. Michael smiled, his heart filling with hope. A fresh start, he repeated. I like the sound of that. When they returned to New York a few weeks later, things felt different. The city was the same, busy, loud, and fast-paced. But Michael and Sophia had changed. They no longer felt the weight of their past pressing down on them. Instead, they saw the city as a place of opportunity, a place where they could rebuild on their own terms. The fallout from George's arrest had left ripples in the business world, but Michael had managed to steer Grayson Enterprises through the storm. The company was stable, but Michael had made a decision. He would step back from the day-to-day operations. He had spent enough time in boardrooms and on conference calls. Now, he wanted to focus on something else, something that mattered more. With Sophia's encouragement, Michael began setting up a foundation in his father's name, dedicated to helping those impacted by corporate corruption and abuse of power. It was a way to right some of the wrongs that had been done in his father's name, and a way to create something positive out of the darkness they had endured. It felt like a fresh start, a new purpose for both of them. As for Sophia, she threw herself into her art, something she had always loved but had abandoned during her years in hiding. She set up a small studio in their apartment, and her work quickly gained attention. Her paintings, vibrant, emotional, and deeply personal, became a reflection of her journey, of the struggle she had faced and the hope she had found. It was her way of reclaiming her voice, of telling her story in a way that no one else could. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their New York apartment, Sophia turned to Michael, a thoughtful look on her face. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," she said, her voice soft. Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" Sophia smiled, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "What if we got married?" Michael blinked, caught off guard. They had talked about the future, about building a life together, but marriage hadn't come up, at least not yet. But as he looked at her, sitting there beside him, her face glowing with happiness, he realized there was nothing he wanted more. "You're serious?" he asked, his heart racing. "Completely," Sophia replied, her smile widening. "We've been through so much, Michael. We've already proven we can survive anything. So why not make it official? Why not start the next chapter of our lives as husband and wife?" Michael's heart swelled with love for the woman sitting beside him. She had been through so much, more than most people could imagine. And yet, here she was, asking him to spend the rest of their lives together. It felt like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Let's do it," Michael said, his voice filled with joy. "Let's get married." 2 months later, in a small ceremony in the French countryside, far from the chaos of New York and the life they had left behind, Michael and Sophia stood together, hand in hand, surrounded by a few close friends. The vineyard where they had spent their first days of peace together was now the setting for their new beginning. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other for the rest of their lives, there was a sense of profound relief, of closure. The weight of their past, the danger they had faced, and the darkness they had endured seemed to melt away, leaving only the light of their love. "I never thought we'd get here," Sophia whispered as they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, her eyes filled with happy tears. "Neither did I," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But we made it." They had come through the fire, and now, on the other side, they had found something worth fighting for. A love that had endured the worst the world could throw at it, and a future filled with hope, joy, and endless possibilities. Together, they had built something stronger than either of them had ever imagined. And this time, nothing could take it away.